My name is Katrina Turk, and today I will be discussing the asbestos disaster in Libby, Montana. We will be talking about the objectives of this presentation, the termalite, actinolite, asbestos, an overview, timeline of events, map of the Superfund site, observed deaths of mine workers, comparison of deaths of workers versus residents, and efforts to restore Libby, Montana. The objectives of this presentation is to provide context for the asbestos disaster in Libby, Montana, understand the health consequences for those exposed to asbestos, and learn about the aftermath of the cleanup. In Libby, Montana, there was an exposure to a naturally occurring asbestos called termalite actinolite, which while mining was released into the air and contaminated the air source. Asbestos is a carcinogen that an individual can be exposed to through inhalation, ingestion, and dermal contact. If exposed to asbestos, it can cause difficulty breathing, chest pain, and a range of other cancer symptoms. The most common diseases that can result from asbestos exposure is lung cancer, asbestosis, and a rare cancer called mesothelioma. Other forms of respiratory diseases and cancers can result from exposure as well. It can take anywhere from 10 to 70 years for those chronic diseases to develop. The most vulnerable groups in terms of asbestos exposure are workers within construction sites due to naturally occurring asbestos within mines and asbestos used in construction. Looking specifically at one of the most common diseases resulting from asbestos exposure, asbestosis, you can see that while deaths due to asbestos have been decreasing steadily since the EPA banned the use of asbestos in the late 90s, it still has a high incidence throughout the United States. Timeline of events. In 1920, a company called Zonolite first started their mining operations for vermiculite. After many years of operations, it became clear to the company in 1956 that asbestos exposure was a concern for the workers mining, but they did not tell their employees about it. And as early as 1960, there were workers starting to show signs and symptoms of asbestos-related illnesses. Shortly after, in 1963, the company was bought by W.R. Grace, who was also aware of the potential exposure to asbestos, but nothing was done. In 1980, the EPA conducted 4 separate studies on the dangers associated with asbestos exposure in Libby, Montana, but kept quiet about it. 9 years later, in 1989, the EPA banned the use of most asbestos nationwide, which forced W.R. Grace to close its mines in 1990. 9 years later, the EPA was forced to dispatch a cleanup team, and they declared Libby a Superfund site shortly after in 2002. Finally, in 2009, the first public health emergency was declared in Libby, Montana due to asbestos exposure. Here is a map that shows the Superfund site located in Libby, Montana. You can see it outlined in yellow. As you can see, there are 8 different sites altogether. This map locates the 3 plants in Libby, Montana that led to the asbestos exposure. Location 1 was of the mine and mill, location 2 was of the screening plant, and location 3 was of the exfoliation export plant. Each of these sites led to asbestos exposure of workers and contamination of the town's air. Many of the people working in the mine and nearby processing plants exposed themselves to asbestos without knowing it or the risk. In the decades to come, they would ultimately pay the price for the work they did in the form of mesothelioma diagnoses or other asbestos-related diseases, as shown in this bar graph. As you can see, there were hundreds of deaths due to asbestos-related illnesses among workers in plants and mines. These are just some of the most common chronic diseases that come from asbestos exposure. Note that this graph is just showing deaths from 1960 to 2001. Earlier, it was noted that it can take 10 to 70 years for asbestos-related diseases to occur, so there are probably many more to come later after 2001. The workers bore the brunt of the dangers associated with the inhaled or ingested asbestos, but family members and neighbors also suffered from the asbestos contamination. The asbestos that silently contaminated Libby's production became airborne. The wind carried fibers aloft to nearby homes and businesses, and these fibers were also attached to workers who then returned home with the fibers attached to their work clothes, which contaminated their loved ones. This table compares the deaths of workers, residents, and households of asbestos-related diseases. As you can see, while many workers experience asbestos-related illnesses, a great amount of residents and household contacts did as well. This pie chart shows that while workers have higher rates of deaths due to asbestos-related diseases, it was relatively close to the amount of deaths of residents with asbestos-related diseases, with occupational exposure deaths being 64% and non-occupational exposure deaths being 36%. This shows just how toxic the air became from decades of mining. Efforts to restore Libby, Montana. Cleanup in Libby is the longest-running asbestos cleanup project in American history. It began slowly at first as workers from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency identified the sources of contamination and began an extensive Superfund investigation. The EPA and state agencies have spent decades on the cleanup of the Libby site. In 2014, the EPA found that its efforts successfully managed the risk to residents. In 2018, it completed projects in Libby and the nearby city of Troy, and this included over 7,600 properties. Now, vermiculite manufacturing is more strictly regulated, with the product having to be screened for asbestos before being released for industrial or private usage and purchase. However, during the time that the W.R. Grace mine was operating, these measures were not taken. The EPA is not done cleaning up the area, so asbestos is not completely gone from the site. Of the 8 operable units listed on the Superfund site, only 3 have been partially removed from the list. Even today, living in Libby, Montana, or any other place with a similarly dark legacy of asbestos contamination has its risk. With the asbestos lying just beneath the soil, erosion by elements such as wind or rain could bring the hazard, now suppose remediated, right back up to the surface and right back into the water and air in the region.